Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for coming back for session 5 of our discussion of faith in a digital age. Today we're going to be talking about cell phones and the effect of those on our continually connected life. So again, I approach this from a perspective that the technology is not good or bad, that there are things about it that are wonderful and there are things about it that are challenging for us. But I do want to start with a story about a time before that. And so I've shared this story with my congregation before. It's a story from my time back in the Army when I was a young lieutenant. And the unit I was a part of for several months had been assigned to be the funeral detail for Fort Polk. And what that meant is if there was a person who was former military who died in that area, so Louisiana, East Texas, and Mississippi, we would be the ones who would go out, and my soldiers would be the soldiers who did the 21 gun salute, and I would be the one who would present the colors to the bereaved spouse or the next of kin. And so on the one hand, it's a position that is an honor to be a part of that. But on the other hand, when you are locked down month after month after month, and when you want to be somewhere else on the weekends, it becomes a drag pretty quick. And this, again, in a world before cell phones, we would wait and wait and wait for the phone call to come in. And there were many weekends where I stayed at Fort Polk and nothing happened. And so it had been several weekends since I saw the person I was dating at that point, who was in College Station, where I graduated from college, about a 4-hour drive away. And so one weekend I waited and no phone call came in. And so I finally decided, you know what, I'm going to go. I'm going to leave. And so I drove to College Station that weekend and came back. And that Sunday when I returned, there were several messages on my phone of basically, where are you? And so I did what I was supposed to do. I called everybody back. I apologized. I did everything I could, and I learned from that experience. But I also realized that experience would have never happened in a world with cell phones, because I may have been on the road and I'd have gotten the phone call and I would have turned around, and it would not have been. Nobody would have known differently. We live in a world now to where we are connected all the time. There's good in that. That again, people can find us, and when there's information we need to know, we can hear about it. But we also live in a world in which we're connected all the time, and even when we may not want to be found, or when we need to take a break, that there is no space where we're not available, unless we intentionally set some boundaries of how we use the technology. And when we say, hey, I'm available during this time for these things, and I'm available during these times for emergencies. So again, think about what you use your tablets for, or your cell phones. And cell phones and tablets they're based on the same technology. They're basically extensions of each other. A tablet is basically a larger version of a cell phone. But there's a lot of things that we do with them. So they're everything from our calculator to they store music to they store videos to you use them for banking or games or any number of ways in which we, sometimes we actually use them as a communication device, whether for texting or phone. We use them for social media. We're going to talk about that more next week. We use them for all kinds of things. And the reality is that, they store a lot of data. The reality that I can have days worth of music, or multiple movies, or multiple books that I carry around in my pocket, that just carrying around and available for when I want to use them is a great asset. The reality that I can connect to through the internet to a navigation site that can get me from point A to point B where I've never been there and I don't have a map. Great technology. So it does a lot of great, cool things, but it also, we talked a little bit about cognitive offloading last time, where, it becomes a place where we store things. It becomes the place where we store our schedule, where we store the weather, where we store all kinds of things that we don't have to think about, but also we need to be continually reminded about because we've committed them to this digital device. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about email, in the world of continual connection, where there really is no escape. There is no way to get away from it unless you are intentional about setting those boundaries. And one of the things that is prevalent on most smartphones now is the pop-up, to where things are pushed. So whether it's an app or whether it's your email or whether it is social media, you'll get things that push out to the front screen to alert you, hey, here's something you want to look at, or here's something we think you want to look at. And the reality is that our world itself is evolving around this technology. I'll be honest that my church is a beneficiary of this in the fact that we have a cell phone tower on our property that pays us rent every month. And, it's a nice additional income that we're able to use for different things, that we're able to use to try different things. It is, the technology is now being woven into the vehicles that we drive. I remember there was several years ago a commercial for a Ford vehicle. I don't remember which vehicle, but it was a Ford. And, they used what was the technology at the time, the iPod, and they had all these things that were kind of alluding to the iPod, and okay, here's the vehicle we're actually talking about. And the vehicle itself didn't have the connectivity even to be able to plug in a slave cable to be able to use your iPod in that vehicle. Now, most vehicles that are new, and it's not the vehicle I drive, but most vehicles that are now new have basically a tablets type technology integrated into the vehicle itself, that you can do your navigation, you can do your music, you can do all those things, and it's just there as a part of your vehicle. It's the way in which the technology is continuing to migrate and be moved into different areas of our life. I think when we start talking about cell phones, again, one of it is just the availability, and cell phones evolved from something that was very huge and very clunky and very, very expensive to something that, quite honestly, we now carry a portable computer with us. But cell phones also began a new type of communication, and that was texting. So I know that there are lots of people who love texting, lots of people who don't like texting, and I think that's one of the things that we have to be able to communicate about what is of value to us. There are lots of times where I love texting because a single text back and forth may save me a 15-minute meeting. But there are also times where it's difficult because it's hard to communicate certain things, certainly emotions or other things during text. But one of the things I have noticed, and this is both a good and a bad. One of the things I've noticed is that people in text and then later in social media, those boundaries of communication, those things that we may be hesitant to say, we're maybe more likely to say in a text where we don't have to do the face-to-face interaction or to hear a person's disappointment over a phone line. So I think this is one of the realities where you see people, for example, breaking up over a text. You shortcut that discomfort, but it's also less acknowledging the other person's feelings in the midst of it. So it can feel very impersonal. It can feel very damaging. It can feel very dehumanizing to another person. On the other side, I've also been in the recipient where somebody was uncomfortable telling me something face-to-face, and yet they were willing to disclose something to me that they needed to tell me over text. And so my first experience with this was when I was taking some coursework at the University of Central Oklahoma. And I was in my late 30s, early 40s, and many of the students there were in their early 20s, so texting was a way in which they communicated. And I was very open about who I was, and so they knew I was a pastor. And then some of them would start reaching out to me, with concerns they had of, okay, here's something that's going on in my relationship that I would really like to talk to somebody about, but I was afraid to approach you in class about this. And it was a way in which I was able to build some of those connections because they were willing to communicate that because the boundary was lower, that they didn't feel as stressed about sharing something in a way that they may have felt stressed doing it. Now, the flip side of that, the same thing that can be a positive can be a negative. And so there are times where people share too much over, and certainly in social media, but over text or over an email or whatever. And the technology lowers that boundary to a place where it may feel safe, but it may not be as safe as people think. I know one of the realities is, I've certainly heard stories of this from my wife of, people she's done counseling with, of, they've sent a picture to somebody, and then that picture got shared much more broadly than what they thought it would be. So cell phones in and of themselves, cell phones and tablets, I think one of the things to realize about them is, in contrast to computers, we're designed for the consumption of content, not the creation of content. Now, we use them to create video. And yes, there have been things that have been added on to where people now can do word processing and spreadsheets and things like that on them. But that's not what they were originally designed for. And most of what they are designed for is the use of, the apps. The smartphones and the tablets were designed around these smaller programs that were designed for predominantly for entertainment, whether to be a communicator of media, so things like YouTube or social media, or whether they were games or little things that we use to keep track of various things. But they weren't really designed for the massive creation of content that computers were. They weren't designed to be originally tools for the business world. They've become that. I mean, people use them to do everything from banking to swiping a card to do a customer transaction. But that's not originally what they were designed for, and that's still not what they are predominantly used for. They are predominantly used for the consumption of information and data. And again, I'm not saying entertainment is bad. I don't believe it is, but I do think it would, if we go back to some of our discussion in previous weeks about that continual distraction, when we're continually distracted and when we're continually entertained and we're not dedicating our time and space to the things that are important to us or the things that bring value to our life, then I think it's something to pay attention to and something to set boundaries around. I know there are lots of times where people come up and feel like, wow, I've spent all this time engaging with this device, and there's some emptiness to that, and we're going to talk a lot more about that next week when we talk about social media. I think the other piece in the midst of that is, if we socialize people to use any device to cure their boredom. Now this is not unique to cell phones. I'm bringing the discussion up here, but it's not unique to cell phones. I mean, it existed with the internet before. It existed. I mean, that was the fear of when televisions were introduced, that people were going to spend all their time just watching this device and passively participating in it. Same thing with video games. Same thing with anything else. And the reality is that it's an easily available type of thing. So I'm not saying it's wrong to, give your kid a tablet to say, hey, I need to finish up dinner. You can play this for a little while. Or, here's a break. You can take this and use this as a break. But if we end up using any device as basically a babysitter or to shortchange our interaction with the people who are valuable to us, they learn that value. And then when we maybe try to take that away from them, it becomes resistant because it's that which they've looked to when they were bored and when they were seeking attention. So I think one of the faith frames I want to put around this topic is the idea of Sabbath. And I particularly want to go to the idea of Sabbath as it's articulated in Deuteronomy. So the Ten Commandments get articulated twice, once in Exodus 20 and once in Deuteronomy, in its chapter 5. In Exodus 20, when they talk about Sabbath, Sabbath is highlighted in light of creation. The Lord your God rested on the seventh day, and therefore you should rest. But when Deuteronomy talks about the idea of Sabbath, it's articulated in terms of, remember, you were once slaves in Egypt. And so you and those who serve you and your animals and everybody is to have this time of rest. That you were designed for rest, and that there is this time where you need to take a break from commerce, from everything else. And again, maybe that's for entertainment, and that's fine, but I do think that there is that time where we do need our rest, and we do need to talk about what are the boundaries that we put on our use of these technologies, and what are the boundaries that we set, so that we're not continually engaged with people far away and not necessarily engaged with the people who we are in the room with. I think one of the things that is important to think about is how we think about our leisure time and what we do with it. So, in our society now, we often think of work as primary. What you do is the most important thing. And that's the opposite of the way things were in the ancient world and the world the Bible was written in. So this is from Ellen Davis, who's an Old Testament scholar at Duke University, but she says, we regard work as primary, while the rest of the time of what we do is time off. But it's the opposite in the ancient world. The Latin word for business is negotium, literally, not leisure. The time when one does not have to work is the norm by which all other activities were measured. I think that that's important, that we were created to have this time where we weren't working, where we weren't connected, where we weren't having to worry about all these other things. And so I know there are certainly times in my life where I've been on vacation and all of a sudden my vacation has ended because something has called out and said, hey, I need your attention for right now. Or I've been doing something and there's been the stress of, hey, here are these incoming texts or messages, and the movie you're watching, okay, yeah, you're not going to pull out your phone, but you know that there's something going on you probably need to pay attention to in the near future. All these things can become a distraction in our life, and I do think that one of the things that many of us long for is that idea of Sabbath, that time of just rest, that time of being separate and distant. And I think part of it is we can set those boundaries. We can set those boundaries to say, this is the kind of life I want to live, and this is what is healthy for me. So I don't know about anybody else. I've certainly had this experience where you leave the house and you don't pick up your cell phone and you realize it and you just don't feel right. We feel like we're leaving a part of ourselves behind. And I do think there is something to these devices that we become addicted to, partially because we've committed so much of our knowledge to them, so much of our remembrance of things to them. But I think there's also this fear of missing out, this fear of being disconnected. And that fear of being disconnected is a really powerful fear. We're going to talk a lot about that next week. It's we as humans are created for connection. We desire connection for each other, and when we don't feel connection, we feel shame. So I think one of the pieces of this has become kind of that, for lack of a better way of saying it, that umbilical cord that we feel connected to the rest of the world through. I wonder about one of the dynamics I'm seeing evolve is people spending so much time recording the event that they're at or the things that they're a part of that they're not present in that time. I go to concerts all the time. I love live music, and I probably will take a few pictures in the midst of a show, but for the most part, I'm present and I'm there in the moment, and that's what I love doing. Now, maybe for another person, it's not a distraction, but for me, it would be a distraction to be focused on trying to record everything and to document everything and not be present in the moment. I think one of the things that is certainly intensified in the constant connection of the cell phone is that waiting on the other person's response. And even like if you have two Apple type devices, you see the little ... as somebody is responding or typing. And it's like, okay, I'm waiting on the edge of my seat because I want to hear this response. And I think we become sometimes captive to how somebody else is going to respond or waiting on that other response. Again, all these things are not evil or bad or everything. I think it's partially you just have to think about how you want to use it. What does your phone help you do with? How do you value the experiences you have? And what are the times that it's important to be present with the people who are in the room? And what is the times in which it's important to be present with the people who we're connected with across, it's no longer a phone line, across the phone waves, the microwaves that go from the cell tower to the device and to the other person's device. Cell phones can connect us with people across the world. They can connect us with what's going on across the world. And, they can be used to communicate with people who are very close to us, but they can also be used to communicate with people who we may never know and may never interact with. On the other side, they can also take us away from the very people who we want to be close with, who we want to be spending time with. And a lot of these things are choices that we make. We were created for rest. We were created for Sabbath. We were created to be in connection with other people. And when it comes to any of these devices, whether it's email or internet or cell phones or social media, how are they helping us connect with one another? I think that's one of the questions that we need to ask. What are the boundaries that we set for our usage with them? You know, how are we valuing our time, and not just our work time? How are we valuing our leisure time, our time away from work, that time that should give meaning and hope to the rest of our life? You know, when we are using our cell phones, do we feel like it is something that is a value? Is it something adding value to our life, or is it something sucking energy out of our life? If it's something that's sucking energy out of your life, then set some limits around that. If it's something that's adding value, then that's great. Is it adding value to your relationships? You know, I think one of the things that we continually need to work on and develop is that communication we have between one another, you know, either within families or among friends or coworkers of, you know what, this is what means something to me. You know, a text means this to me, but a phone call means this. For some people, a text is equivalent to a phone call. For some people, a phone call means so much more. Now, I'm an introvert. One of the things I like doing least in the world is calling a person on the phone. I do it. I do it because it's part of what I need to do. There are people who it matters to me to do that. But just openly cold calling somebody is something that is not something I enjoy doing, whereas texting lowers the anxiety of that for me. But it doesn't always communicate the same thing. And that's something I have to be aware of and others have to be aware of. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you for watching this 5th installment of this class on the digital age and faith. Next week, we're going to move into social media and the projection of our digital self and that need that we have for connection and the dangers of that need for connection. So again, thank you for watching. I hope you have a great week, and